Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at a very similar UI from the previous video, but for a different purpose. Last video we were looking at the sell items UI, where we were looking at being able to select an item here from the UI and be able to sell it to the merchant. That's what we were looking at before, but we need a different UI, which is very similar, but just to display the current inventory and the current contents of the player's wallet. How much gold is the player holding? This UI will be behaving a little bit different in the game. When it's actually in use, it should follow the player. The merchant UI can be static because it's just going to happen there where the merchant is. So I think that makes more sense for it just to show up there, like a board comes up when you talk to the merchant. But for the player inventory, I want that to appear wherever the player is and to make sure that that is easy to use for the player on the move. So we'll be looking at the specifics of how that UI is going to be looking with the player interactions in the next video. But for this video, I just wanted to cover the basics of setting it up and making sure that it's working. So if you remember from previous videos, it follows a very similar structure for the UI. You can see it here. We have the UI here with in the same components here. Make sure that it has an OVR raycaster so that we can actually interact with it in VR. And then it has the inventory UI script that's handling the linking here to the player so that we can get access to the player's inventory here and all of that. Pretty similar to what we've seen before. Then similar frame from last time, just using the same sprite here. Similar header panel with slightly different text here. Then we have the inventory panel, very similar. It has a top level component that has a grid layout here with the same cell size and padding from before. If you want to see how that is set up, I recommend you check the previous UI video that we did on the sell items UI. Inside here we have a prefab. This is very similar to the sales slot prefab, except it's just the inventory slot. So this one just has an item. And you can actually see here for the sales slot here, I changed it so that it inherits from the inventory slot, so that the sales slot is basically an inventory slot, so it has the public item here, but it also has the item price, which is the behavior that we had last time, just making sure that we're not repeating ourselves too much here. So instead of having basically the same class with one extra field for the sale, I made sales slot inherit from inventory slot, and that way we can keep things a little bit simpler. But this one, in this case, is just an inventory slot. Then it doesn't have a price because we don't need that, and we just have 20 of them, same as before. And then we have the wallet panel. Here, this is where we're going to show how much gold the player has in his wallet. And then, much like before, we have the coin as the image here, except it's not interactable this time. We'll have to see if we want to change that behavior later. And then we have the text here. And for this, I added a new component here that we have now. In the previous UI, we had a text updater here that would just grab some updatable text and then put that into the Text Mesh Pro text here for the component. But I want to try something different here. So this one is slightly different. So we can check that out. This float updater takes an updatable float variable that we're going to look into in a little bit, and then does pretty much the same. At the start, it sets the text to whatever value is in the updatable float, and then the updatable float has a callback that's called unupdated here that triggers when the float value changes, and then we use that callback to update the text here in the Text Mesh Pro GUI here. So let's quickly look at the updatable float then. So updatable float here, as you can see, it's a scriptable object. I tried a few different things here, which we'll cover in a little bit, but the final product, the solution that I landed on, was using it as a scriptable object. I tried fitting it into an interface pattern, and I tried fitting it into its own like separate class that could be used elsewhere, but I ended up going with a scriptable object here. And it works pretty much the same way as the updatable text. It has the delegate here, unupdated callback float delegate, unupdated here that we saw before, and then it has a float value that is private. This is the actual value, and then we have the public value, which it's a property. When you get it, you just return the float value, and when you set it, you update the float value and then trigger the unupdated callback here. Pretty much the same that we did before. And then I added here, this is back from the float reference class. If you remember, we have the static implicit operator that whenever we're doing operations, it makes the updatable float work kind of like a float. It doesn't always work. There's some updates that I need to do to the existing code to make this work, but ultimately that's what it ended up being. And that meant that I needed to update the wallet here for the player with the updatable float for gold. And I'm still not in love with this structure, because now if you go into the files here, into the asset files here, now the player wallet is just a reference to the player gold, which is the actual value. And the player gold is an updatable float here. You can see, okay, well, the player has 100 gold. So this level of indirection is not horrible, but it does mean that unless we extend the wallet to do more things, we may end up discarding the wallet completely, the wallet class completely, and just use gold as an updatable float. Similar here for the merchant. That's how it's set up. That's the only big change here. If we look at the other code, there are some updates to the wallet class. Oh yeah, we haven't talked about the UI enabler. So if we go to the player here, I added the inventory UI enabler script. This is basically a very simple script that just takes two variables. One is the inventory input. That's basically what input we're going to put in the controllers to actually trigger the UI, and then the actual UI that we want to enable. And then in the fixed update cycle, if the button is pressed, then we toggle the active state of the UI, right? So if it's disabled, we press the button and then the UI is enabled and it shows in the scene. And if the UI is enabled and we press the button again, then it disappears. That's basically it. Pretty straightforward. We have the inventory slot and sales slot covered. Talked about the float updater as well. We can go through this, but it's basically the same code as the sale UI with very few modifications. At some point, I'll need to check if it's worthwhile to just merge both and maybe make the sale UI inherit from the inventory UI class and then add some extra methods. For now, I'm keeping them separate because they have, although very similar behavior, they do have a few differences here. But yeah, this mostly points to issues with the level of abstraction here that we could improve that, but we'll look into that at a later time. For now, I would recommend, if you are interested in seeing what the inventory UI does here and how everything gets updated, check the previous video on the sale UI. It's all covered there. It basically just collects all the inventory slots and updates them on interaction, but it's pretty straightforward. You can see that in the other video. And the updatable float we already saw. So that's all the changes. Let me just quickly test this in VR so you can see it. Alright, and we're in. As usual, since we're using SteamVR, we need to restart the scene to get the hands back in. Now we have the hands and we should be able to trigger YEPs. We can trigger the UI now. If I press the B button here, that's what I have it assigned. In the config, we'll see in a second. If I press the B button, the UI comes up. I can select the items. For now, there's no particular reason to select the items, but we could see if we can, drop them, merge them, craft with them. There's a number of interactions that we may want to support here. And then here we can see the actual gold value. We still need to make some changes here to add the prefix here so we get the $sign. But other than that, the UI is working. It's looking fine. One thing that you may not always be able to see, but the UI actually has a little bit of 3D into it. So you can see a little bit of a parallax effect if you're going around the UI. That is what we have right now. As you can see, it's working. But I'll leave for the next video when we're actually going to make the UI follow the player and kind of stick around the player's view. I have some code for that prepared, but we'll check that in the next video. For now, this is it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.